You've been watching live coverage of George Best's funeral in Northern Ireland here on the ITV News channel. It's been a very moving service. We've heard readings from a number of different people. Callum Best, whom you just saw there, George Best's son, read a poem. The service opened with the hymn, "The Lord's My Shepherd." We heard songs by Peter Corey, and the whole service finished with a prayer, and then with Brian Kennedy singing "You Raise Me Up." Big crowds have lined the street throughout the morning. Up to 30,000 people will be allowed into the grounds, have been allowed into the grounds there of Stormont. Only 300 allowed to attend the service itself. It's been a combination today of private service with a family, initially held at the family home, followed by the procession through the streets of Belfast, with many people throwing flowers, some people throwing football scarves as the hearse arrived at Stormont. And then this very formal occasion, the first post-war service ever to be held in Stormont. There you see the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Peter Hain, standing beside the England manager Sven-Göran Eriksson. So this was the formal occasion. It was an opportunity for Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom, the world to say goodbye to George Best. And Eamon Holmes, who's the Master of Ceremony, there chatting away, talked about his admiration for George Best. The service covered the whole of George Best's life, really, from people who knew him when he was a very young lad, when he was first spotted in Northern Ireland as a talented teenager, people who spoke about his footballing prowess, who'd played with him through his years at Manchester United and thereafter. There was tributes from family. He was obviously much loved by his family. His son broke down in a very moving moment as he tried to read a poem dedicated to his father. And then there were tributes too from his doctors, with his surgeon saying, "You know what, you're meant to keep a distance from patients, but it's something I never managed to do with George Best because I became his friend." So the funeral cortege will move now from Stormont, and once again it will become a family occasion, because the funeral cortege will move to the Roselawn Cemetery. It's the family plot, and George Best will be buried next to his mum, Anne. He was apparently tortured for much of his life about her early death. She died from alcoholism as well, and George Best felt responsible in some ways. Other family members said it was quite wrong for him to feel responsible, but he felt that additional pressure had been put onto her because of his superstar status. The fact that she had folk camped outside her door taking photographs of her. She couldn't really go anywhere without being recognised as George Best's son, and he felt that he didn't give her enough support, and that made her drink more. Callum and other family members, including her husband, George's father, said that simply wasn't the case. But George loved his mum very deeply, and he's going to be buried beside her in the family plot at the Roselawn Cemetery. And the family have asked that there be no members of the public there, and no photographers, and members of the press are going to honour that. That's Martin McGuinness, who's a senior figure within Sinn Féin. He's a member of the British Parliament. He's also a member of the Northern Irish Parliament. He was the Education Minister in the Northern Irish government until it was suspended. And this service has taken place at Stormont, which is the home of the Northern Ireland Parliament. The last person to be given this kind of funeral in Northern Ireland was Sir Edward Carson, who was a leading light in the establishment of a separate quasi-independent state in the north at the time of Irish independence. His statue dominates the entrance. George Best transcended, as we heard throughout that service, transcended the sectarian divide. He himself was a Protestant, but we've seen many Catholic celebrities taking part in today's memorial service. and he has asked that as a memorial there be an All-Ireland football match played in his name. Ireland, of course, plays football separately. Southern Ireland as one team, Northern Ireland as another, unlike rugby, where there's an All-Ireland team. So it's an unusual request from a Northern Irish Protestant to see an All-Ireland football team play. But everybody said George Best really wasn't very interested in sectarianism. He liked the idea of bringing people together in Northern Ireland. Well, I'm joined here in the studio by two sports journalists in general, sports journalists in particular, Michael Crick and Mira Bowes, who sat and watched that service with me. Now, Mira, I don't know about you, but I found Callum Best's reading particularly moving, because in amongst all the tributes we've seen in the last week, we've tended to lose sight of the fact that George Best, although he's public property because of his name and his skills and his role as a national icon, he was also a family man, and Callum Best clearly loved his dad a lot.
Oh yes, and that came over, and as you said, he broke down and couldn't, was struggling to finish the poem, and the emotion of what a son must feel saying goodbye to a father whom he probably came closer towards the end than he had been before. He was living away in the States and so on. That was very vivid. And I thought the speech of the surgeon who treated George was also very moving in its way, and it showed. It's very interesting, very moving service, much more sort of a memorial service than sort of a classic, if you like, funeral service. But I suppose that's how the family would have wanted it.
Well, there were religious elements in it, weren't there? The family pastor, Michael, addressed the congregation. But unlike a normal church service, there was applause. There was a sort of sense people didn't know whether to applaud or not. There's been a lot of clapping this week for George Best. You don't normally clap in a church. Certainly don't clap in Protestant churches normally, but people were just bursting into spontaneous applause after the various songs that they heard.
Yes, it was more of a memorial service, which is surprising really for such a religious country, Northern Ireland. But I don't think he was a particularly religious person, George Best. And it was also, I think it was very moving when his sister, she too, broke down at times, and explaining how she loved him and made much greater efforts later on in life to get to know him better and to be there for him.
She said she was intimidated by him, and he said to her, listen, we should be better friends than we are. And they became better friends too. That's the one thing that runs through all of this, is that he was very much a loved man. He had his ups and downs. We saw him in public, we saw the drink, we heard about the violence occasionally, but those around him seemed to have cared deeply for him, whether they be the doctors that treated him at the end, his son, family members of the public who were writing poems for him. They all seemed to care deeply about him. And
I thought the doctor, when he said he'd never heard of George Best, and yet he developed this relationship with him.
Wasn't that an extraordinary thing to say? That reminds me of one of those High Court judges who said, "Oh, the Beatles." How can you not have heard of George Best?
I don't think it was quite like that. He'd sort of forgotten who he was, I think, because the implication.
Wasn't there somebody who said who's Paul Gascoigne when
I think that was a High Court judge. No, I suspect you're right, Michael. I think at the end of a long and busy day, he probably just couldn't quite bring to mind who George Best was in the context of treating his other patients, because he told the story of how his secretary came in very nervously. He'd had a long day operating and looking at patients and consulting, and she said, I've squeezed an extra person in, it's George Best. And
the fact that the secretary did that showed that George's pull on the females was still held.
That's assuming it was a female secretary. But but we've got to remember with George Best, there was a long period where he sort of went out of the public eye, and during the 80s and 90s, when for a long period football was unfashionable. And as football has had this extraordinary revival in this country in the last 10 years, and this and this great nostalgia fest of books coming out about players who were stars in the 60s and so on. Best, has benefited from that as well.
It's worth contrasting that when Bobby Moore died, and this was around about the time of the awful the Boulder boy, and the country had a feeling of remorse that we hadn't acknowledged Bobby Moore and things like that, and and the way we've reacted to George Best, that there's a much better feeling in the sense that he was a great player, great person, tragic death, but at least what we're paying him the full sort of tribute, if you like.
Northern Ireland's a small place. It's got a population of only 1.5 million, and there's some estimates today that 500,000 people, 500,000 people, a third of the population of Northern Ireland have turned out to line the streets. And we see some of them there. They're not big crowds there. That's inside the grounds of Stormont, because the police decided that they would keep the numbers down inside Stormont for a whole variety of different reasons, security being one, but also the condition of the grass there. It's incredibly wet, and the grass is incredibly slippy and boggy and soggy, and the people who are organising this just didn't feel it would be safe to let large numbers of people in there.
George Best wouldn't have worried about it. He could have played on that.
I know. But you highlighted that Martin McGuinness was there. This must be one of the few occasions in Stormont that different sides of the political divide have come together there.
And I think it was next to David Irvine, wasn't he? The former, from the Protestant side. But
it is extraordinary, isn't it? We've got to pinch yourself sometimes to look at that, David Irvine and Martin McGuinness sitting side by side, and remember how far Northern Ireland's travelled. The flags outside this Parliament building at Stormont, they're flying at half-mast. We were talking earlier about the significance of this. It's a place where symbolism is enormously important, and obviously it's symbolic that it's the Union flag that flies there. That's obviously what the Unionist people of Northern Ireland want. They want the Union Jack to be flying there. But the flags are flying at half-mast, and it's the first time that has happened in Northern Ireland for anybody apart from a member of the royal family. And some people were saying, that sentimental way that people have of saying things at these times, that George Best was Northern Ireland's royalty. He was their Princess Diana. That's what some folk in the crowds were saying today. And certainly there's an element of the Diana about the funeral and the way that people are responding, isn't there?
It's a very spontaneous sort of occasion, isn't it? Just as Diana's was.
And some of the, and actually the way that the way the funeral service was conducted was very sort of modern and very much like her funeral service. What was it, 7 years ago?
Except we didn't have quite the speech that.
No, there was no equivalent of the brothers'
attack on the royal family.
But certainly the way in which the crowds were, smothering the cortege with flowers was very reminiscent of that.
It's interesting that two of his former wives, as well as his current partner, were there.
Yeah.
And I think that speaks volumes about him.
He kept very much in touch with his ex-wives, and they were exasperated with all the work that they tried to do for him over the years, and were remarkably tolerant of his lifestyle.
But it says something about him, that they never really fell out in absolute bitter acrimony.
Has to be said too, they look remarkably similar when you see them all lined up. Don't they?
Yes.
I thought the music was particularly moving.
I thought the music was gorgeous. I have to admit I hadn't heard of Peter Corey, but he was the singer tenor who opened the service with Bring Him Home. It's a sentimental service, wasn't it?
And also the choice of songs was sort of reminded me of my youth, of the 60s, that sort of thing. It was
songs were tearing at the heartstrings, weren't they? But Northern Ireland's quite a sentimental place in lots of ways, isn't it? Beneath the hard veneer that a lot of the outside world sees, it's a very warm, sometimes rather sentimental part of the world.
They started with the Don McCallum song of Vincent, and that set the tone.
Well, we're going to take a short break now. George Best's coffin is being loaded, has been loaded now, back into the hearse. And I think, rather than take a break, I think we'll follow this for a while. You hear the sound of the lone piper playing a lament. We've heard a combination of Scottish music with the piper, Irish music in the church. Let's follow the coffin for a while as George Best goes on his final journey.
Go.